Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Institute of Advanced Studies in Paris, and welcome to the second day of our workshop, Reclaiming the Climate. I think most of us know each other from yesterday, so I guess I don't need to introduce ourselves, the organizing team. I just wanted to start with one or two rules for this, for this prestigious institute. As you can see, it's a beautiful historical building. So this means that absolutely no drinks, coffee, or food are allowed in this part of the building, in this hall. So make sure you finish, you consume everything downstairs. In the courtyard, we'll have lunch indoors in the cafeteria. I think we unfortunately we are limited to people for plans for those who registered, and I was supposed to kind of triage, but it seems that that everybody can join us for lunch. It shouldn't be a problem in that case. Yeah, so and then at the end of the day, we'll also have an aperitif, drinks, cocktail once we're done. Culinary-wise, it should be an exciting day. I'm sure also content-wise and academically. And then another thing is just make sure when you come in and out of the building to close the main door downstairs, because it's heated up just for us, and if the door is open, all the heat will escape and will be contributing unnecessarily to climate change, so let's not do that. And then for the toilet, you just take the stairs in front of the main door and by the elevator on the right. Otherwise, we're not allowed to wander through the building. Don't go up the stairs. Don't touch anything. It's a protected, it's a protected heritage, patrimoine.
A nice chair from the 17th century, if you want to say it, if you want to move a bit. But not much. On the first floor here, on the right, there is a chair which was supposed to be with people.
Yes, it's only for Anne Hidalgo when she comes to visit us.
Sorry.
Yeah. So yeah, that's it, I guess. And so we're very happy to open up the second day with the keynote presentation by Vanesa Castan Broto. Vanesa is a professor of climate urbanism, so the title already suggests that she's really the right person to speak in this conference. A professor of climate urbanism at the Department of Geography and the Urban Institute at the University of Sheffield. Her research focuses on the interrelated themes of the governance of climate change in urban areas, urbanization and the dynamics of energy transitions, and barriers to the implementation of climate change action. So all of these topics are very, very pertinent. That's why we're thrilled to have her here with us. Vanesa has many publications. I'll just flag out her book, Urban Energy Landscapes with Cambridge University Press, and an ed book with Linda Westman, Urban Sustainability and Justice, Just Sustainabilities and Environmental Planning. I actually showed that book yesterday in our opening presentation, talking about this proliferation of writing in just the last few years on climate justice in urban areas. So welcome, Vanesa. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome. And also, yeah, it's really lovely to be in this building. So with all these restrictions, it's actually like this, the emotions and the spaces that make who you're important. That always catch up when I'm in a place like this is like how these symbols of power is also enchanting, no? And they become like something that brings us together. But also, thank you very much for, even if I were here, organizing this conference, because I think it has, yeah, and I'm really sad I can be here. I actually did plan to be here, but Somehow I was called to go to Zurich yesterday, but even the title, Reclaiming the Climate, is important because, as you all, climate change has been increasingly used to advance technocratic action, technocratic discourses, even more inequality, even more injustice. And I think it's time that we say, well, actually, climate change maybe is something that we can take in a different way. So if you've been discussing that, and I heard from Natalie that you actually did discuss that very deeply yesterday. So I'm really pleased that you're having this conference and well, that you have me here as well. So what I want to talk today on the promise of mundane innovation. Mundane innovation is a little idea, more like an hypothesis that I'm trying to use to put together some pieces of work I'm doing, like to give some coherence to the work that I'm doing. And but is something that's coming out from a European Research Council project, LOACT. So a lot of the work that I've done it with two researchers who have been really important for me, and we've worked together. Now they've gone independently. So one is Ping Huang, and the other one is, you've mentioned, Linda Westman. And actually that book that you mentioned, it was very important for Linda and me because we sat together and we say, oh, what have we done all on our careers? Can we put it together in a book? And that's how that book came about. So it's a book that I really loved. But let me explain you first, before I go into talking about what is mundane innovation, where this comes from. Okay, I'll do it like this. Yeah. So starters, all my career is motivated by what is represented in this slide, the relationship between urbanization and climate change. And urbanization and climate change are the two biggest phenomena which are influencing life in the Earth today. And this relationship between urbanization and climate change is actually very complicated. And it is only now that we are starting to realize how complicated it is. So the last IPCC report, for example, and that's the cover of the Working Group 1 report, explained that, made an argument that perhaps we had for very long assumed that urbanization was one of the sources of carbon emissions. But when you look at the data on the whole, that relationship is not granted. But what is really granted is that the impacts of urbanization compound the impacts of climate change. So when you have urbanization, those environmental impacts of climate change become worse. Like, for example, it happens with the urban heat island effect. But at the same time, urbanization is very important because it shapes directly what we can do in the city. Urbanization shapes everything from how we understand ourselves in a space to the forms of governance and whether local governments are acting or not. So it becomes something incredibly important to understand climate action. So for that reason, during the last, well, now 7 years since I've been in Sheffield, I've been creating this group on researching on climate urbanism. So the idea of climate, and that's why I have this title, Climate Urbanism is a research program which is based on an hypothesis. So instead of talking of urbanization, we talk about urbanism, because we are not talking about change and growth in the urban areas of the world, but we are talking about a way of thinking the urban that is shaping the ways we act about the urban and the ways we represent it and the ways we interact with the urban. That's urbanism. For example, like geographers like Eugene McCann have talked about that. And then the hypothesis is that we are living in a moment in which climate change is what is shaping the urban. It's what is shaping this relationship with our forms of settlement. And it shapes that in different ways. So for example, it shapes that in the kind of prescriptions that we make about the city, the kind of recipes. So now, for example, we are going to talk about circular cities, and then everybody talks about circular cities. But it also shapes, it also helps us to understand how the different ways in which we configure our thinking about cities is creating new forms of inequality. And that's the central, the critical perspective on climate urbanism, an analytical approach to understanding the causes and consequences of how we build cities. So for example, if you may have all read the work by Jennifer Rice and Joshua Long and Anthony Levenda and others, in terms of thinking about how climate change is this narrative that is creating a new way, perhaps even reimagine the neoliberal city or the entrepreneurial city in new ways to implement that. But finally, and perhaps less understood, what I was trying to do with this research program was to think about how climate change was shaping our relationships with the space in a more fundamental way, because as you know, who we are relates to where we are, and we are persons as being in the world. So when that space around us change, we also change, and that's another way in which we can think climate urbanism. So through those three strands of thinking, the European Research Council grant has focused particularly in the first two, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit more. And it's focusing on when we look at the way we think about the city and the way we act on it, what we find is that there's still a gap between the way, so there is the space of imagination that is constrained by our histories and our relationships and our situation of us as humans. And for example, is what Castoriadis calls imaginaries. And that's like the building blocks of the things that are generated, some form of imagination in our world. And then there is the action. And when we think about action, I'm not thinking about the action that we do to maintain our lives every day, like taking the metro like I did this morning and drinking a coffee. No, when we think about action, we are thinking in the sense of Hannah Arendt's sense of action. We take action to change the environment around us, to make something different, to make a different course for the social life that we are having. So between the imaginaries that are socially generated, but inside our heads, if you want, and the action, there's a whole structure of the ways we rationalize and the ways we organize ourselves. And I mean, in my work, for historical reasons, I've been a little bit influenced by Foucault, and by this kind of Foucauldian scholarship of environmental governance. So you won't be surprised that I think that there are some conscious narratives that become like discourses that are repeated across space. But that's different from the actual imaginaries, the actually possibilities for the future. And I think perhaps that's where there is a big gap, isn't it, in between the way things are rationalized and the way things are imagined. So when we think about this, the first thing for me, the most important thing is what is actually happening, the action, the kind of top story. So what kinds of low carbon, climate resilient action emerge in rapidly urbanizing areas in the context of rapid urbanization? And then particularly when we think about emergence, we think about something that is new, innovation. Because innovation doesn't have to be something very sophisticated. It can be something that, some ways of thinking that are, some ways of doing things that are new, some new outcomes. But if we think about innovation in relation to climate change and urbanization, we need to think innovation into the spatial context. First, because even thinking about what is new and what counts as innovation, what counts as some new action, depends on the spatial context. Second, the spatial context determines the possibilities to have resources, to have some innovation. And finally, the innovations themselves also transform those spatial contexts where innovation happens. So starting from there is where we come to this definition of mundane innovation. And I was particularly influenced here by a French sociologist called Gabriel Detarde. And Gabriel Detarde was very interested in how we reproduce life through routines and repetitions, and how those routines and repetitions sometimes become interrupted. And when the routine and repetition of everyday life becomes untenable is when you get an innovation, because you need to adjust, you need to change what you are doing. And therefore, if we kind of build on this idea, very simple idea about how innovation and how new action may happen in a space, then we come to this idea of mundane innovation as the kind of innovation that emerges from that interaction with space, that interaction with everyday life, and related to embodied knowledges and a dynamic relationship between people and environment. So mundane innovation is not like, I don't know, an innovation in Silicon Valley that some very clever person has put together, but rather mundane innovation is something relational, something that emerges in the relationship with the material around us, something that emerges in our relation with our families or with our friends or with the forms of organization or with the things that matter to us. So I've been 7 slides and I've only talked random concepts and theory. So let me give you some examples so that I can illustrate a little bit what these kinds of mundane innovations can be. So for example, we have so following from the European Research Council, we have now a new project in the Philippines, which is called Urbanize. And so in that project, we work with informal communities, which are all part from the Homeless People's Federation of the Philippines. And when you go there, the Philippines is one of the countries which is more heavily impacted by current impacts of climate change through typhoons and also through heat and other forms of impact. But when you go to the communities, many of them are already managing these things. And for example, in this community in Davao, the municipality built this big concrete dike there on the photo at the bottom corner. But what happens is that the water comes, the dike may stop a little bit the force of the water, but the water still comes. And then when it goes away, it leaves behind all the waste, creating additional health risks. So a typical example of climate urbanism intervention that creates inequalities and kind of disturbs the relationship with the environment without really solving anything. And so what has happened for many communities is like they walk around and they know the mangroves around because they have lived in them, and they realize perhaps they can do something to kind of transform that. So in this case, they got help from an NGO, which is the Homeless People's Federation of the Philippines, which is a network of informal settlement communities, but it's supported by several NGOs through something called the Philippines Alliance. And also the municipality helped them to establish these seedlings, and now they're having to develop this kind of mangrove regeneration project, which also has different spin-offs and has created new spaces for recreation and so on. So it's a very little project, but it's a project like when I visited it, I was like, apart from it being beautiful, when you look at it, it's also like a story that they like to tell, a story, something that they like to share. So it creates a lot of positive energy. But it's not necessarily only a grassroots innovation. So an innovation led by grassroots people, but it's really an innovation that emerges at that interaction between this kind of national level network of organizations, the municipality, some other resources. So it's interesting how it's developing. Another example, this is from a community energy project that we have funded by the UK government. And what we do in this community energy project, we are trying to create a laboratory in Mozambique of community energy, but we also look at experiences, existing experiences of community energy. And sometimes people assemble these community energy projects in very haphazard ways, makeshift ways, like bringing resources from all kinds of places. So in this case, this is a community called Chipopoma in the north of Malawi. And this gentleman, whose name is John Silency, he kind of had this dream that because there was a waterfall there, he could provide some nice energy for all the people that lived in his community, and he was very happy about it. And but actually, when he tells you the whole story, he assembled resources from all over. So first started with generators somewhere from Brazil, got a donation, got some friends to design and develop a system, which is now he wants to modernize and to do different. And then he got a grant from some support from the University of Strathclyde to develop some knowledge from United Nations to do again just this complex network of intervening in a way that mediated time by the people and relationship of the place. So again, maybe this more like I would say John really led the thing, but he Oh, okay.
Go for it.
Oh, okay. And there can be distributed differently across the different sectors. So you see, for example, network sectors like in the energy supply may have less evidence of mundane innovation. But in terms of thinking about food systems or thinking about urban planning or even transportation and adaptation, mundane innovation is very common, and it's really what happens in those cases. So we need to start reading the governance of those different forms of action that are taking place and the kind of innovations that are generating. So in conclusion, I think for this, in terms of what kinds of low carbon, climate resilient innovation emerge in rapidly urbanizing areas, mundane innovation is widespread and appears in all sectors, but is rarer in interventions at large scales and in network infrastructures. And just to say that mundane innovation is not always social innovation, because mundane innovations also appear attached to technological responses to climate change. So we shouldn't think it's just like social outcomes that come from mundane innovation. But what it does, it relates to actions from place-based actors, and it mobilizes local knowledge, even if it's through partnerships or led by the national government. So, Nat, sorry, I've lost track of time. It says here that I've 46 minutes, but I think because this was started before, how long I have?
You have more time if you want.
Yeah.
Officially, we should be finishing at 10:30, but we have a long break and we can easily eat 10 or 20 minutes.
So I have 10 minutes? Okay.
We have a discussion afterwards.
Yeah.
Okay. So because I also want to show you some research, because if you remember, the diagram is what actions can we do for climate governance? But there is all this like little bit at the bottom of the diagram. So discourses, imaginaries, like ways of thinking about the city. So I wanted to answer also these other questions. What are the implications of mundane innovation for climate change governance? And to start interrogating this question, we've done 2 pieces of work. One has been thinking about how we are currently imagining the future of the city. So what are the discourses, the consolidated, explicit discourses of future city making? And we've done that by looking at compiling the policy reports published at the international level in terms of shaping the international policy discourse from 37 organizations. So first we compile all the organizations that we think, or the main organizations that we think work in the climate space. So, you know, the ICLIS of the world, C40, United Cities and Local Government, but also the World Bank, United Nations Environmental Program, UN Habitat, I mean, you name it. And then we compile all the reports that they had published since the 1990s with a focus on climate change, and that say something about cities. And then we try to analyze the discourse formations about what kind of city do they imagine in these reports. And then second, we say, well, okay, it's like how you imagine the city, but it's also how you imagine action. How do you think about doing action on the ground? And this is something that relates more with the way we present ourselves in our speech and in our discourses. So what we did is to look at in-depth interviews. So use a speech language, and in terms of speech, how people talk, when they talk, what they do, in terms of their actions that they are taking. How do they think they're intervening in changing the world? So we did 100 in-depth interviews. We went to COP conferences, and then we just networked there, and through snowballing, we created like a sample of 100, let's say, professionals that work in the cities and climate change environment. So, and then we focus on analyzing action. What is the action in these speeches? In terms of the kind of discourses of the future city, I'm not going to surprise you by showing you this. So this is how, these are, I would say, if you look at the different building blocks, they all come together around these 3 discourse formations. City, which is a kind of focus on traditional ecological knowledge, notions of carrying capacity, and thinking a lot about inventories, policy futures. There is this other body of policy thinking which is distinct because it has different kind of groundings, which is the smart city. And the smart city really emerged with the growth of the city, the city that is space competition and is going to make the city more effective in terms of use ICT to really make a difference to cities. What is happening, apart from the very strong critique that is coming from the social sciences about the new forms of inequality that are related to smart cities and the ways they are not acting in the way they're expected? What we are seeing also now is that in practice, we see very, very few examples of smart cities or smart city technologies or ideas really being put in practice in effective ways. And finally, the resilient city is something that it was very started to be heard around. So instead of experiments, I think it was more like different waves of thinking coming together through the 2000s, and so how those waves came together, and I would say now is the dominant framing in terms of our thinking of future cities. In conclusion, so we still see the eco-city or occasionally furnishing motivations behind some actions and strategies. So in our experiments that I showed you before, eco-city motivations may be there, but there are very few that are really based on those principles. We see very little evidence of smart cities. Only 3% of all the actions that I show you had any ICT component. 3%, very little. But we see resilience as a very dominant discourse that almost every initiative engages with in some way. So I think this starts to tell you about the relationship between those discourses and those actions, and the fact that we have those discourses that we tell to narrate the city, but they don't always match what we do in cities. And how we do it, how we think about action. So this comes more from the interviews. This comes from the interviews that we did with professionals. And when you look at how they talk about action, you see that the forms of action that are imagined and envisaged in discourses of climate change, urban climate action, are actually very limited. So most people think action is finance, and they tell you, I will believe on this when it has a budget allocated to it. So facilitating access to resources. The objective there is organizing large-scale finance. You have people talking of implementation, and you would think, oh, maybe implementation is the moment that everything unfolds. But actually, most of the implementation thinking is about creating the institutions. It's about networks and institutions and creating those institutions that enable action. We have some thinking about operations and delivery, but it's always like in terms of the actual delivery of specific elements of the action rather than compiling the action as a whole. And we have monitoring and evaluation. And I think this is the disconnect between discourses of policy action and actually the taking action and the kind of experiences that I've told you about at the beginning, when people tell you how to do things because they are doing them on the ground. So I think this separation, you can also compute this in terms of, so this is the number of, how these different, where these different forms of conceptualized action came in the different interviews that we had with academic, climate networks, international finance institutions, NGOs, and so on, and the local government and private sector. And you see, this is also the conclusions that we got from this is that most actors, in fact, conceptualize action in relation to what they already do. So it's not action, it's not something that they imagine out of them, but they see what do they do, what their institutions, what is the rationale of their institutions. So for example, if you look at, I think the best example is the International Finance Institution that thinks that action is financing and making massive, enormous projects and putting a lot of money somewhere. But action is not just that, it may need that, but that's like a component of the action. So I think because actions are conceptualized in this way, the kind of international discourses of urban climate action that we are seeing and they're being mobilized through these national programs, they actually tend to reinforce the kind of state of things that we are, so that people continue doing what they do because that's how they imagine it, and they don't imagine that it could be anything else. And the agency also is located on individuals or individual institutions. So for me, agency is something that emerges in relations in between, influenced by feminist neomaterialism, and the interactions is what I think enables things to change. And this is something that you see very clearly in examples of mundane innovation, but it's something that you don't see clearly in these discourses. So I'm going to conclude. Finally, and going back to this diagram, so we've talked about the imaginaries of action that at the moment are very limited. And it's actually very sad to see that people just cannot conceptualize action from beyond what they are doing. And then you have these consolidated models of the city, which are actually also where the resilient cities are starting to dominate, but also these other two, eco-city and smart city, that perhaps are organizing a little bit of the thinking, but not really relating to what is happening on the ground, not really relating to the alternative futures. So for example, the off-grid futures, the decentralized futures, the kind of experiences of place that people are maybe having and maybe enacting through mundane innovation. And I think that's perhaps a missed opportunity. And in fact, so there's clear evidence of mundane innovation in what is happening in the actions in rapidly urbanizing areas. But this maybe discourses of climate action or of urban climate action are misrepresenting what happens. And there's this need for us to think of what is going to matter in terms of delivering low carbon futures. So my final thoughts are that mundane innovation for me is what happens. In the end, you are not going to have many actions if they are not related to what people do. They may happen for a while, but they may disappear, which may be what it has happened with a lot of smart cities initiatives. But of course, this poses a practical challenge for us because these mundane innovations don't fit neatly into our understandings of the future city. And particularly, they cannot be computed. So most of those cities, the smart city particularly, and the eco-city, they had a strong emphasis on quantification. So, for example, a lot of the ideas of eco-city were circulating around ideas of eco-budgeting. A lot of ideas of smart cities are about optimizing systems. So it's an effort of computation that doesn't apply to this mundane innovation. And also, it's important to know that when we do action, it's perhaps the only moment in which we have the opportunity to challenge those imaginaries and to perhaps challenge our own forms of action. So it's by doing action that we create new forms of action and new ways of imagining action. So perhaps that's positive, but also to remember that all the examples that I've shown you in that map, they are not necessarily positive. They all have implications, and they all have redistributions that happen around them. So we need to be more careful in how we analyze what is actually happening on the ground. Thank you. Yeah, I guess maybe to the end.
Very much. That was great. I think we were small enough to just have an open conversation. It doesn't necessarily need to be moderated. So I'm not going to moderate.
I have one question relating to the rationale of the workshop, because yesterday, and I want to relate that to what was discussed yesterday, and I think it is an issue, because the rationale of the concept note we wrote with Nathan in order to make this workshop was to reinterrogate the justice issue from a community-based place, located, I don't know how to say it, from a community point of view. And yesterday there were a lot of demonstration of what these communities were doing in terms of ecological thinking, in terms of ecological action. What you tell us this morning is what you see on doing field work is a lot of mundane innovation coming from these communities, but this innovation are not taken into account in a more general way. But you're not asking the question of justice. You're not, this word has not appeared. And I would like to know why, but I have some questions. But I was thinking, how do we relate this issue of more mundane innovation, more reclaim climate place-based claims, I don't know how to say it, but no way to think about justice in a more transversal way, because if the international community is not taking into account this mundane innovation, this community place-based innovation, how to make justice an issue, how to build a federation of. I was talking to Castan this morning, and I had this idea about federation of justice. But I think there is an issue of redistribution and in many ways. So it's a very general thought. But,
yeah, no, it's really important. And yeah, like, of course, a lot of things remain unexplained, and they will need perhaps a further explaining. But all through the 2000s, some of the communities that were working on urban resilience found that community-based adaptation was actually, at the time, the only adaptation was taking place, and highly effective in terms of how we do climate change action. Towards the end of the 2000s, with the emerging literature on cities and climate change, there was this sense that perhaps communities could take the lead also in mitigation. What's happening in infrastructure provision, which really is what mitigation is. What is happening when you do that is it's great to recognize and celebrate communities, but you are also shifting the burden of responsibility to communities. And that's where the justice issue emerges. It's like, not only I'm receiving all these impacts, but also I'm having to behave like this. So what I think mundane innovation offers is the recognition that if I'm a national government, I can do something that matters to communities. And I can do it myself. I can lead it myself. I can put the resources and then enable communities to build their understanding and their ideas into this place. And there's this kind of balance between perhaps ideas of co-production and so on, between who is taking the burden of the responsibility for the action and who is having leadership and autonomy to define what they want for the future. So it's that complex interaction, I think, is perhaps the most important justice issue that we are dealing with. And even I haven't said this is justice, but this is why. So maybe justice is the normative motivation that informs my research. It's like, how are we going to make action that is good for these communities, that these communities want, that matters to these communities, but that these communities cannot do alone. Because like in some of the communities that we work with in Philippines, they are left alone. They are left alone. They are dealing with all that. In the best of cases, they are asked to relocate. I mean, it's just not right.
Okay. A question directly into that. Because well, first of all, a bit of a question of clarification. I guess the concept of the mundane, it's difficult, at least for me, to distinguish it from the community. It sounds like mundane would be community, but it's not, right? It's the state can also provide mundane.
Yeah.
In fact, you were saying that most of what the state is doing or whatever any actor is doing is mundane. And then mundane means that it doesn't fundamentally change anything. It's just sort of trying to adapt what we have to.
I think it means more like it emerges from the everyday experiences of whatever is needed in a place rather than something that is conceived in a, I don't know, in some virtual laboratory or something.
Because then I have a question about these two pie charts that you showed us, where there was a surprisingly large provision of the state, which I think when you presented it, it sounded like you were negatively surprised by this, or at least you were somewhat negatively surprised by seeing only 2% community provision. And I wanted to link that to that question of sort of responsibilitization, co-production and responsibilitization are often very close together. In a sense, I was wondering, isn't that quite good news that it's the government doing its job? But then at the same time, of course, the question is, what does it do? Because in many cases, this top-down.
But has a negatively, so there are a couple of things that I feel negative about. One is that I know that communities do a lot, so I'm sad that we cannot compute that, we cannot reflect that. And it is really a pity, like, for example, I don't know, you go and try to write something on how to intervene in the urban for the IPCC, for example. You need all the evidence of communities doing things because you want them recognized, right? You want them recognize that they've done something, and that evidence is not readily available. And I think that's negative. But I agree with you that it's very positive that national governments do things.
Allocate something to the, let's say, national government category if they are the main driver, I think.
Yeah.
So there might still be communities involved, but not in the main.
That's absolutely correct. And in fact, I didn't show we also have done some analysis of partnerships. And I think it was something like about 70% of the initiatives have some form of local partnership, some local connection. So, but it's important that the initiative and the leadership is taken by the national government. But the other thing that the pie chart, I don't know if I'm negative or more like surprise, is that 10 years ago, I thought that the local government was going to change the world. And and I kind of feel like, obviously the local government is many things in many places, and not all countries have the same systems of local governance. They are all varied, but I am a little bit sad that we don't see a more prominent presence of local governments and municipalities and mayors leading climate action.
If you like one more question is that your methodology focuses on what is there, but perhaps the most important question is what is not there. Is there any way in which your project takes into account? I guess you could start from problems and then see how many of the problems are addressed and how many are not addressed. And your research shows, I mean, imperfectly, I'm sure, but the problems that are addressed. But
yeah, so here I politely disagree, because I just think the most important thing is what is taking place. Because that way of thinking of what is our problem is the standard way of thinking of most urban climate action. So a lot of people say, oh, we need more efficient systems, and I go and I develop this new water system. But nobody has worried to think, what do people do to manage their water? So one example I've engaged with for a few years, now I don't do empirical research, but other friends of mine continue there, is the case of Bangalore, for example, which is a city in the south of India, or Bengaluru. It's a place where there were ancient systems of managing water, like not that work always perfectly, but it worked more or less. And then come engineers and start to shape the city in completely new ways, thinking there's no system to manage water. No, the first thing you need to know is to understand what's going on. And it's only from there you build on that action, because that's the more transformative action is the action that engages with local capacities and local knowledge.
Isn't there such a thing as, let's say, mundane inaction? As in, it is you stay close to what people are facing and need, but there are still cases where they are not able to mobilize resources.
You can do co-design and co-produce all kinds of new things. I agree, but not by starting but always considering first what is going on.
What's the question? Thank you so much, Vanessa. It's very interesting. So I guess I had two related questions. One was, so in the pie chart you showed where the national government was, prominent. So in terms of kind of what it means to lead an initiative, so were you able to in any way follow the money or follow the value kind of produced as well as circulated or invested? And the reason I ask this question is, again, going back to this point about, what is the problem that is being solved and who is kind of investing resource in solving it? Because there is this, I think this ties a little bit to what you were talking about yesterday too, Isabel. To what extent do national governments and private sector actors, are they able to invest in local kind of solving local problems without expecting returns, or without seeking to control, engineer local processes? Because I think a lot of this discourse, for example, talks about, de-risking investments, and essentially the flows of money that are embedded in climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So that was one question I asked. Well, leadership, finance, how does that, tell us a little bit about who is doing the work here, who is in charge here, who is solving what problem for who? And then I think the second question I had was, I guess maybe I wasn't entirely sure what your take was on this. Because on the one hand, you were talking about mundane innovation that is very embedded in local places and actions. And then you talked about how this climate policy talked by these thought leaders is disembedded. So I guess normatively, do you think these things should be linked? Are there any dangers to mundane innovation and top-down climate policy coming closer to each other, especially in terms of, questions of power, who is doing what for whom? And, what are the types of, I guess, political formations that would help link these in a manner that would serve the ends of justice?
Yeah, so for the second question, so perhaps that was my little sentence there at the end, that, there are complex relationships between those discourses. And what do we want? Do we want a policy discourse that is perfectly adjusted and therefore always efficient and always improving our lives and always like making us more efficient and more active? And maybe that's not what we want. And of course, there are big pitfalls with those. But I do think it is a problem when, for example, the ways carbon emissions are computed at the international level and so on, and the ways they lead into certain national plans for action and the kind of prescriptions that we are making. So I think that that's a little bit problematic, and perhaps it could be improved without necessarily having this wonderful rationality. I'm very wary of that kind of thinking as well. So I agree with you. The truth is, I don't have an answer for it. I mean, the mundane innovation is something very new for me, like perhaps a concept of the last couple of years only. And I'm writing a book with Linda and Ping now, and hopefully that will come with some ideas. But that precisely we are writing the last chapter of the book is on that relationship that you're talking about. And I think my conclusion is that this is not something that we can solve very easily, right? In terms of what normatively we think. I mean, what do we think about international policy discourses of climate action? Do we need them? We don't need them. So shall we put them away? Shall we behave as if they don't exist? Or shall we embrace them, try to change them? And I think through my career, I try to embrace them and change them because I think they're influential. It's more like a bit of a realpolitik kind of thing that but no, it's a good question. Not a good answer, sorry. About the finance thing, so when you do this kind of data collection, yeah, we always compile data for finance, budgets, and it's never very good. And we never can make any analysis of it that makes any sense. But a few things that we observe is, one is that the private sector is not very prominent. And I think that's really interesting. And I kind of hope that may change. Particularly may change with the new increasing concerns about the insurance, and maybe that the debate changes a little bit in the next year. But no, we don't see the private sector investing on it. Also, one thing to say is that many of these initiatives, they may not always have big budgets allocated to them. So a national government or even a local government can lead a lot of action that doesn't have big budgets associated to them. And that's also important because a lot of the most important climate action sometimes it's not resource intensive. Even, for example, if you think about decentralized programs for community energy, I mean, they're ridiculously cheap considering the benefits they provide, but they are not self-sustaining. So you are asking something that is providing a social service and an ecological environmental service to perform in a commercial basis, and it's not going to happen. And finally, the one thing I would say is that from the interviews with the international finance institutions and also the other practitioners, there is still a very strong drive to associate urban climate action with big, enormous amounts of money. So we still see emphasize these enormous projects and now with the nature-based solutions and the emphasis on it's only worsening. This massive, there was this new biodiversity conservation program in Africa, which looked to me like something totally unmanageable and not very much place related.
I wanted to just go back briefly to the question of for the different types of justice. And yesterday we had a really interesting presentation on epistemic versus hermeneutical justice and the different forums and the different ways in which the knowledge that many of the group that you presented here as case studies or the broader big data analysis are also about. And I'm wondering in general, what did you see, if you saw anything, that was an innovation in the way in which the knowledge of different groups, civic communities, residents, was being uptaken, was being positively valued and visibilized by maybe national governments or local governments? And do you have any example of things you can share? Because oftentimes, as you were saying, there's now just a question of recognition, of valuation of knowledge.
Yeah, I think, so if you were asking me what is the most important form of justice we have to address, probably epistemic justice would be, and particularly the deficit of credibility that some people face. Because what is happening is that a lot of people are not recognized as valid interlocutors in climate change debates, and bringing those interlocutors into the table is really important. And that kind of thinking about epistemic justice transforms our ideas of participation and recognition in justice debates. So I think that's a massively important question. And yes, so precisely some of the things, the dynamics that we are seeing in some of these initiatives, I mean, this data is very superficial. It doesn't enable you to do, not the case studies I presented, but the database data is superficial. So it doesn't enable you to make an assessment of whether participation occurred or not, whether people were consulted, whatever. So I don't have that from the data, but from some of the case studies, yeah, there are some good examples. So there are different ways in which both the deficit of credibility of people, but also the hermeneutic justice, the right to decide the futures and the imagine their space can be addressed. And sometimes this can be through, like my head is like, I'm starting to be exhausted. Yeah, so for example, in the case of Philippines, some of them can be through social mobilization, and where you organize the movement, or also the Belo Horizonte way speakers, and then you create the kind of arguments, the kind of critical mass that makes people visible, and there's no other way but absorb them, but understanding. But another way is to transform the ways in which knowledge is produced. And this is something that has to be done by those very powerful actors who are producing knowledge. So that's why I think ideas about post-colonial knowledge and so on are so important, because then it starts to question ourselves as producing knowledge, starts to try to think what other forms of knowledge are more important than those that we have. So it starts with us.